Okay, so today we're going to go ahead and get started on the U.S. federal government and how it all works. We're going to be talking about the different branches, and we're also going to be talking about the checks and balances system that the branches have. The three branches of government that we have are the executive, the judicial, the legislative. And if you note that when I post this online later, there is actually a hyperlink that I have on the second slide that is called Congress for Kids, and it gives you a lot more information about our federal government and how it breaks down into the branches. The first branch we're going to talk about is the executive branch. Now, the executive branch is headed up by the President of the United States. Their responsibility is to carry out federal laws, recommend new laws, direct the national defense, and perform ceremonial duties, such as traditions that the U.S. has. Their powers include commanding the armed forces, like we mentioned earlier, dealing with international powers, so going overseas and working with other countries, being the chief law enforcement officer, and vetoing laws, which is part of our checks and balances system we'll talk about in a few slides. The next branch that we have is the judicial branch. The judicial branch is actually headed by the Supreme Court, and their powers include interpreting the Constitution, reviewing laws, and deciding cases involving states' rights. Now, interpreting the Constitution, we've talked about the Constitution in previous lessons, and we know that the Constitution is a document that our forefathers drafted up to be the basis of our country and our government. So their job is to primarily go ahead and interpret it and make sure that things are constitutional. Our last branch is the legislative branch. It's headed by Congress, which we're going to do a lesson on later in this unit. And Congress consists of two houses, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate, and their primary reason for being is to make laws. Their powers include passing laws, originating spending bills, impeaching officials, approving treaties, and their checks and balances is override vetoing the president. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but let's go ahead and look back at impeaching officials. Now, many of you may not know what impeaching is, but impeaching is actually the removal from office. So it's actually taking a person away from their position. And this usually happens when a person like the president or higher officials are starting to do things that are not in the best interest for our country. So that's why they have that power. Now, our three-branch government system works on a checks and balances system. The system was put in place so that no one branch of the government could become too powerful. So in this case, the legislative, judicial, and the executive branch can check one another so that none of those three branches can become too powerful and start acting in the interest of the U.S. without the approval and without the assistance of the other branches. We're going to go over some examples of the different types of checks and balances that there are. Example one is the executive branch has the right of presidential veto. So the president actually has the right to stop a bill, veto a bill or a law, and just stop it from happening. And this usually takes place when the president feels that this bill or this law is not in the best interest of the U.S. The next example we have is when Congress overrides the veto, which means that the president can veto or stop a bill or a law, but then Congress can in turn override that veto by a 2/3 vote in the House. And this happens when maybe the president is making an error in judgment, or the Congress feels that the president is making an error in judgment, or even maybe when the president is listening to supporters as opposed to acting in the best interest for the country as a whole. Our last example that we have is from the judicial branch, and that's when they can actually declare things unconstitutional. Like we said, the Constitution is the basis of our government, and what happens is sometimes bills and laws slip through the cracks and they actually go into effect, but it's the judicial branch that looks at them and reads them and determines whether or not they're following the guidelines that are under our Constitution. Now that you've learned a little bit about the branches of government and how the checks and balances system works, we're going to go ahead and talk about the fact that we're going to do a great project that's going to consist of you creating your own representation of the checks and balances system. It's going to be your federal government poster project. And we're going to do a little bit of research into checks and balances to learn a little bit more about it. But ultimately, you're going to create a poster and present it and tell us how you understood the checks and balances system in the three branches and show us how you feel it can be represented in the poster format. So thanks for listening, and we'll go ahead and I'll pass out the information sheets about our poster project.